Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon from the UK. I'm Becca Rowland and I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'll be hosting today's OAG webinar. Just to let you know, as always, we're recording this and it'll be available on the OAG website, and if you've registered today, you'll be sent a copy of the recording as well. So please do ask questions as we go through using the chat function. We try to answer as many questions as we can as we're moving through the webinar. So do keep using that, and let's have a good dialogue there. Today we're going to be looking at the summer, and apologies if you're in the southern hemisphere. I know it's not coming up to summer, but it worked for our title. So other summer holidays, certainly in the northern hemisphere, are going to provide sunshine, but the airlines, or is it a case of summertime blues? Now, this morning when we ran the webinar, my slides didn't move on at this point, so I'm hoping that everybody can see this. We're going to look at the usual OAG data and get some insights on that to see what's happening this week and this month. And then we're going to be looking particularly at international schedule capacity, particularly as it relates to some of the leisure markets that we expect to usually boom over the summer, but maybe not this year. We'll be looking at some airline revenue data and also looking at what's happening with new routes being started. We're seeing a lot of experimentation in the market with airlines trying routes that haven't been operated before, so we'd like to dig into that. So with me today, I'm very pleased to have Peter Hoslin, who's with Pan Asia-Europe Aviation Advisors, and Peter's joining us from Austria and has worked for too many people, too many businesses I think to name almost, but Stockholm, Skavska, Hong Kong Tourism, Oman, Abu Dhabi, Sydney Airport, various others. Welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
And as usual, we've got John Grant with us. John, I guess you're able to be back in the pub this week, aren't you, in the UK? So I'm glad you're here.
Right, just left it to be with you, Becca. You're always more of an attraction than a pint of lager, I must admit.
And I know that in the blog that you've written for OAG this week, there's a picture of a man with his head in his hands. It's been a mad week, hasn't it?
It is. That could be a picture of me when Brighton miss another open goal. But yeah, this industry is at the best of times capable of defying logic, but the last couple of weeks probably have seen some of the most illogical behaviour that we've ever witnessed. The excitement of new airlines, the excitement of new routes being added, which is wonderful. The hoped for recovery, the subsequent lockdowns, a UK government who's announced a traffic light system but forgot to put any light bulbs in any of the traffic lights, and a major international airport that's now charging for passengers to be dropped off, despite the fact they've got no scheduled services operating from that terminal and won't have probably for another 12 months. You couldn't write it up. If it was a comedy show, Becca, you'd throw the script away and say not possible.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing some of your insights as we go through the webinar today. As usual, we're working from a number of slides with various bits of OAG data, trying to shed some light on some of those things that are happening. So let's start with capacity in the market. On the left here, we're seeing the months from May 2020 through to April 2021. And just to confuse people, we're comparing every month with the same month, but in 2019. So May on the left is compared with May 2019, and April on the right is also compared with May 2019. And I'm sure many people in the industry dealing with data are grappling with the same issues of how do we look at data year over year to try and actually understand what's really happening. So on the left, we've got monthly data compared to 2019. On the right, we've got the weekly data for the capacity for the last 8 weeks compared to the same week in 2019. John, what are the highlights here? Is there anything new that we should be looking out for?
Well, Becca, I think the best highlight is we can see this slide this time round. So that's great news. I think, as you're saying, I mean, it's really difficult to draw a comparison when we look directly at 2020. We either see exponential growth rates or depress ourselves further. But for me, I think the biggest concern in all of these numbers and these percentage changes is in the bottom right hand chart where you can see Western Europe, or the whole of Europe indeed, languishing at less than 30% of its normal capacity year on year, and the complete inertia of a recovery taking place in the market. It's just so flat. It's particularly depressing. Yet we have, you know, other parts of the world where there's more optimism. I can't believe that Eastern Africa was one of the fastest growing regional markets in the world last week. Just goes to show if you hang on long enough, anything's possible. But obviously Southwest Pacific, a little bit more of a recovery has been taking place there, and we'll talk more about the Tasman bubble, I'm sure. And in North America, where the US domestic market is just going gangbusters, and you know, the amount of more capacity that's being added to Florida, the hub bypass strategies that we're seeing from some airlines, it really is a fascinating set of market conditions we see and circumstances around the world. No two markets behaving the same, some coming back out, others such as Brazil going back into capacity cuts, Chile closing its borders for air services for a 2-week period. It's just so dynamic. Keeping up with it is a 24/7 job.
So I'm glad it's your job as well. You say the US is going well, but I think Southwest took some capacity out this week, didn't they? Or was that just?
They did. They took 8% of their capacity out, but they are probably the most effective capacity supplier, matching market sentiment to both capacity and demand, and have over certainly the last 5 or 6 months been cutting and adding back capacity as necessary. You know, and I'm sure watching their forward bookings and all of the search metrics that we're beginning to use more regularly, and seeing what's happening. So it's you know, it's just a short-term blip by Southwest. They'll put that capacity back probably next week, the way they behave.
Right. Let's have a look at capacity over slightly longer sort of time frames. So we've shown this slide before, or something similar. Black line is capacity globally in 2019, international and domestic. The grey line is for last year, where we see at this point of the year we were right down in the bottom of this dip. And then this year, the yellow, the dotted line is where we are now. But March data, so 1 month ago, this is where capacity looks. So we've seen quite a lot of capacity come out for this second quarter, and then basically just be pushed back into later in the year, haven't we? We've said this all along, this high level here, what is it, 10, 15% below 2019 levels, just doesn't look realistic, does it, at this point in time?
No, it doesn't. And we, you know, certainly in the UK, as I said, the light bulbs were not delivered with the traffic lights. And so airlines such as Jet2, who plan to relaunch services on the 17th of May, have had to move them back to the 23rd of June, just because of the booking curves and travel profiles. And this lunchtime, I understand the UK Travel Advisory Committee have said they're not going to announce which destinations will be in the green list until the first week of May, which is just 14 days before international travel is supposed to start again. You know, it's ridiculous. It's just abandoning the aviation industry in the UK, and all of the people whose jobs have relied upon it for so many years. And the other thing that we need to be really conscious of here, Becca, is you just cannot, because you do not operate the capacity in March and April, you just cannot then suddenly add it back in August and through to September, which is what this chart looks like it's doing. It just doesn't work like that. And
well, I think when we spoke with Peter before the webinar, you were a bit more positive about the summer, about July and August, about the pent-up demand that's there.
Yes, yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm very much a realist in terms of seeing how the airlines are going to adapt their capacity, all driven by demand. And it's historically always the case that they'll show a higher level of capacity going forward, and it'll be adapted And in the last year, it's always lower than they originally thought. But there's a strong sense, I think, in the travel trade and a lot of the airlines in continental Europe that this summer's pent-up demand is significant and has some real potential to be delivered. And I think there's a sense of optimism that this summer will be strong again. Whether it's longer than the peak we saw last year in 2020, it was quite a good peak period, is debatable. But I see the ETC, the European Travel Commission, has just put out some surveys showing that 56% of their travellers surveyed in continental Europe are very positive about having their holidays by the end of August this year, of which 52% would be by air. And that's far higher than it has been in the last 12 months of ETC doing this survey. So there's a sense of optimism. I think John's right. There's a really good chance that this is going to drop back dramatically in some cases. But yeah, I think there's a good potential for a good summer, all driven, unfortunately, by the uncertainty that we're all experiencing.
Interesting. We've had a question in. Yeah, we've had a question about recovery and what's driving what, is capacity driving demand or vice versa. But I think we are seeing some demand there, but it can't be fulfilled, can it, because of these restrictions in place and the uncertainty then preventing people booking.
Becca, if there was certainty about travel and the easing of travel restrictions and, be it travel passports or testing both pre and post travel, then trust me, the airlines would stimulate the demand. Michael O'Leary would be out there selling €1 fares until he'd got enough people at that price, and then he'd be revenue managing, and every other airline would be doing the same. And we are, everyone from a demand and a capacity perspective is at the starting line waiting to go, and we are at the mercy of the governments and their policy making about international travel.
And as you say, it just can't be switched on at a flick of a switch, can it? It takes time to get the capacity actually working, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Peter, go ahead.
Go back to the previous slide. It's interesting that you see in the left-hand chart of the monthly capacity. Are you able to go back one slide for me?
I'm not sure. I might, if I click, I think, oh yes, I can. There we go. Yeah.
Okay. If you look at the European tracking on the bottom left-hand chart, how you see a steady decline of Europe since August. That coincided very much with the Europeans starting to see the beginning of extra waves, if you like, of the virus. And there was a lot of optimism that they had sort of beaten the virus up to August, delivered quite a good summer travel period. And then from then on, Europe's been in a constant decline, whereas other markets picked up from November. Europe hasn't seen that because there's constant change and uncertainty in the government's messaging about who can travel and where you can travel and how.
And Europe, in fairness, so much more of the traffic in Europe and the capacity is international, isn't it? We don't have the huge domestic markets that you have in Asia or in North America. So it's a bit harder because so much of it is international, isn't it?
Yes,
absolutely. I mean,
the union is supposed to facilitate the international travel, but very quickly national priorities came to the fore when it came to safety and travel.
Peter, you nearly said self-interest there, didn't you?
Okay, let's move on. We're going to look at a few slides that look a bit like this. This is intra-Europe international capacity between country pairs. So, for instance, between France and Germany, it's in both directions. With this top table being July 2021 seats, and then July 2019 seats, and then the percentage difference down here. John, are there any sort of standout things that we can see from this? Obviously, we can see in July 2021, the UK-Spain market on paper is still the largest market, with 8.8 million seats in there at the moment, the capacity.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I think this is an interesting way of presenting the data, Becca. It shows how some individual markets have been a little bit more resilient than others. But just taking that example of the UK to Spain, you know, losing 2.5 million seats is what, about 23% of potential demand, and or potential capacity. And airlines, even in the numbers we're seeing now, you know, we've got a lot of capacity that is not going to be there, and there are some major carriers that have not made it through the last 12 months. Norwegian, obviously, being one of the major carriers who are very high profile, who are about, I think, 10% of the size they were this time last year as we headed into the whole pandemic event. And I think it just goes to show how hard this rebuild is going to be. And, you know, it's going to take a couple of years. And to answer just one question that someone's already asked, you know, when is it all going to be recovered, and are we going to get back to 2020 levels? My expectation in terms of demand is that it could be 2024, and I don't see anything that's changed my mind. We'll probably have another couple of lockdowns and travel restrictions around the globe in the next 18 months as different variants of COVID appear, and, you know, governments react accordingly.
And I think, you know, I've heard you say 2025 before as well, or certainly in conversations we've had. I mean, maybe that's a bit too pessimistic, but, you know, we've got some portions of the market, like the business travel, that maybe just isn't going to come back at all, and that has quite a big effect, doesn't it?
Well, it was interesting to say, Alan Joyce, the CEO at Qantas, was saying that his company's experience of business demand is about a 3-month lag on VFR and leisure demand, and I'm surprised it's actually that quick. I would have thought it could even be longer. It depends in part, I suspect, on the seasonality of the market and the conference and incentive type season, and when these countries will open relative to, you know, the timing of those events. And Clive was asked a question about, will the Dubai Expo act as a catalyst for a global recovery in demand? And to be frank, I don't think it will. You know, there's just too many other restrictions around it that will make it difficult. Sure, the point-to-point market may grow and it may attract some additional custom, but I don't think it's going to be one of these single events that changes what happens.
I think that's common, isn't it? When we've done analysis of big events, you know, Olympics and things like that, we don't really see it making a big dent on travel, do we?
No, and few airlines add capacity around these big events. If anything, they revenue manage, and, you know, the brand awareness tends to be heightened in subsequent years as people watch on TV and say, I'll go to Tokyo next year or Japan because I saw it on the TV and the Olympics were being held.
So when we look at these numbers, to some extent, we're seeing, you know, if I look at Greece here, Greece, France up 13%, Greece, Germany 18%, Greece, UK up 8%. We're seeing airlines placing capacity where they think there's going to be demand and where there may be, you know, that there may be the possibility of travel. So we are going to see, assuming that we can travel, there are going to be some places that do quite well in the summer, aren't they? And Greece may well be one of them, looking at this anyway.
Yeah, it could do, but, you know, until about 3 days ago, Turkey was going to do very well, and then suddenly a big spike and a 2-week lockdown.
So some of these, so this is July, but the Turkey's, certainly Russia's stopped travel to Turkey, hasn't it, till beginning of June, I believe. Yeah. Okay. Let's have a look at the same data, but for Asia Pacific. So this is within Asia Pacific, between these different countries. sort of same and different. We're seeing some, some markets, Indonesia here, Indonesia, China, obviously Indonesia, well, all the China markets quite down. Thai markets on the whole, quite a long way down still, even though they've not had as much COVID as some other places. So a very mixed picture, isn't it? Again, reflecting what the government restrictions are that are in place.
Yeah, undoubtedly, but also highlighting the importance and how strong a position China holds in the international recovery in the Asia-Pac region. It is the single largest international market. There is, we know from lots of studies, significant amounts of pent-up demand for international travel out from China as soon as possible. But I think the other thing is we need to always think about how far forward airlines are currently planning. And for many, the July capacity they are currently putting in the reservation systems and the data they are supplying to OAG is essentially what they plan to operate in 2019, because they have no visibility, no clarity about what their network will look like, how a recovery will occur, what the rate of demand will be, and therefore, what they need to be planning to operate. And at 6 weeks' notice, they are cutting capacity to match what demand there is. It's extremely frustrating for airlines, for airport operators, for fueling companies, everyone involved in the travel ecosystem when we can't plan more than 6 weeks with any certainty at this moment in time.
We are seeing some destinations doing things to try and provide confidence, aren't we? So I know Phuket is looking to vaccinate everybody there to try and make it a sort of a COVID-safe bubble to visit. So are there other innovative things we're seeing in the market to try and get ready and provide confidence and a sense of security and safety once travel can happen?
Lots of DMOs, destination marketing organizations, are working at the ground level with companies in market, be they hotels, restaurants, suppliers, taxi operators, anyone involved in the travel ecosystem. But the whole breakthrough moment, Becca, I think really will be around, and however popular or unpopular they will be, is going to be a vaccination passport and the ability for PCR type testing both on departure and arrival. And if individuals can comply with both of those, then it seems to me that suddenly there is less and less reason for governments to be hesitant about reopening their borders.
So there's a good question from Alex Patterson about the PCR tests, and with the price of them, certainly in the UK, I don't know what the cost is elsewhere. Is it high enough that it's actually going to be a factor that undermines demand, that the price elasticity will mean people won't want to travel?
Well, it was £110 at the weekend in the United Kingdom from some suppliers. We heard yesterday that one company have already, for their preferred airlines customers, reduced that rate to £60. By the time the government makes its mind up about who can and who cannot travel, and we allow for yearly inflation, the price will probably be £15 per passenger.
So supply and demand situation there, the more demand for PCR tests, we're going to see the price come down dramatically, maybe.
Absolutely. So I think in the immediate next couple of weeks, I'd be very surprised if the price fell dramatically, but through the summer season, I would expect it to come down to a level that really doesn't impact the overall travel elasticity. But it's the acceptance by every country of every other country's processes and protocols that is the most important thing. Peter, what's your view? Do you think PCR testing is going to be a barrier or the cost is going to be a barrier?
No, I don't think so overall. From my experience, the costs are about €60, so it seems to be a bit cheaper than the UK. And yes, for a family of 4 or 5 on a short-haul flight, that's pretty significant. But if it does come to what we're looking at here, the longer-haul flights, let's say from Europe to Asia, it's in the ballpark. I don't think it would be influencing that. And when you see that Thailand is building their innovative response, if you like, for both Phuket and other parts of Thailand, where other parts of Thailand outside of Phuket, they're going to allow, or they're going to reduce quarantine from 14 days down to 7 from July. So that's going to be an interesting change in their acceptance of quarantine periods. But it's also about the way that the airports are going to have the capability to make it easy and efficient for people to have their tests after arrival, if that's going to be required, and then pre-departure. And I think most of the airports are determined to do that.
Yeah, there's an interesting question from Helene Becca about testings. She asked, what happens when mum and dad test negative and kids test positive, or vice versa? Well, if mum and dad test positive, Helena, I think the kids are going to have a great time in Cancun and hit the credit card. And my other advice is that if the kids test positive, make sure you get dropped off by the grandparents, and they can look after the kids for 2 weeks. But more seriously, it is a crucial point, and airlines are going to have to be flexible in travel bookings and rebooking in those circumstances. But more importantly, communicate that beforehand so the market knows that airlines understand the risk and are going to be accommodating, rather than saying, sorry, you've just lost your holiday or revenue.
And I get a sense, John, that the airlines are not very proactive in putting this out there yet. I think at middle of last year, they were quite proactive to say, look, we'll be very flexible with you. But I've noticed in booking engines recently and airline websites that they're applying penalties for changes, and you're paying a much bigger premium now compared to the middle of last year for full flexibility. I get a sense that they're becoming a little bit arrogant about that. When they would shouldn't be doing that just yet.
No, I think you're right, Peter. And a lot of them are saying, book before April the 30th for travel flexibility. Now, I wonder if that is part of the game of trying to generate cash flow by encouraging people to book now. And will it then subsequently, when we get to the 1st of May, it will roll over to the 31st of May. But you're right, there's a lot of goodwill to be generated by the airlines doing something that reassures the travellers or potential travellers about, alleviating that risk.
The uncertainty that travellers around the world are feeling is so fundamentally bad. I think there has to be a massive investment in good faith from the airlines, as well as ground transport and hotel providers around the world, to say, we understand that things are going to change. Because a fundamental part of any plan now for business travellers and families is, what's the contingency if suddenly something changes when you're travelling and you either get sick, or you need to leave, or you can't leave. It's unprecedented times to see how people will respond to travel opportunity this season.
Yeah, I agree.
Do either of you see any prospects for some sort of COVID passport or travel certificate actually coming to fruition? I know there's lots in the pipeline, but again, it's a bit like the government activity. We're just not seeing a sort of a united front here. We're not seeing a one solution that's easy for the traveller. It's very disaggregated, very granular. Any?
Very disaggregated. I mean, if you consider EU wants to centralise and sort of have a standardised approach to most of these types of issues to the benefit of the European Union, it hasn't got there in this. So a lot of countries are now embarking on their own passports, and they're all calling them different types of activities. Some are even considering paper as opposed to digital. And so I think it is proving to be very hard. And part of that is the politics that I think that comes with it. That is it discriminatory? Does it discriminate against people who haven't been able to have their vaccinations yet? But the potential is there, and I think it will come together. But at the moment, it's looking very messy.
Yeah.
And you know, it's part of the whole frustration of where we are, isn't it? That, you know, the industry, regulators, authorities have not really got to grips with this. Anyone with a bit of foresight would have seen probably 9-10 months ago that the only way out of this was going to be vaccination passport type processes, and it's just not happened. And, you know, are we applying the best skill sets to these particular problems? It's just so frustrating.
And it has enormous potential, I think, when you consider that there is some discussion about, you know, transatlantic. Does a high proportion of vaccinations underway in the States and in the UK giving enough of a basis to say, okay, we've got a big chunk of vaccinated population on the two ends of the route? Does it open up a corridor for vaccinated travel? A lot of issues around that, of course. Let's see where that goes.
Okay, let's move on. We're going to have a look at one more slide that looks the same as those ones, but this is for the transatlantic capacity. So Canada, US to a number of countries in Europe. What we're seeing, I mean, I guess the question for us is, with the UK vaccination program going well and the US going well, you know, could we see an opening up of a corridor there? I don't think we're seeing that in the capacity numbers looking forward to the summer yet, but it is something we've talked about, isn't it, John?
It is. That, you know, there is no mistaking that this piece of water, the Atlantic, is an extremely lucrative part of most airlines, and certainly legacy airlines networks in normal times, both with the strong corporate demand through to perhaps the middle of June, end of June, but also then very strong leisure demand and the holiday season. So this is what we see here is perhaps a hope rather than an expectation of what will be operated. And the US, you know, there is still certainly hope of a bubble or a corridor between the United Kingdom and the United States. But for many markets, capacity is way down. I mean, if you look at the USA to Canada, for example, it was 1.1 million. This July looks like 700,000. And that's before airlines finalise and you know, finesse their schedules in the last couple of months from May and June. So we're still going to see a lot of capacity coming out here, Becca. This is not going to be a good season, I think, across the Atlantic. There is just too much uncertainty, and the risk of being caught stuck in the United States for European visitors and the expense of that and other such things, you know, it all comes back again to the need for that travel clarity.
So oh, go ahead.
Sorry, John, do you see any potential for UK and maybe even a bit of Europe to the Caribbean as being a strong enough market in its own right to sustain some of the carriers? Because they've seemed to do well with COVID management. Yeah,
I mean, the Caribbean has done really well, and I'm actually just looking at some numbers that a good friend of ours, Jim Heppel, has posted on his weekly blog. You know, and I know Joanne from Aruba's listening in, and they seem to be seeing some growth in their March numbers, which is good. And the Caribbean destinations generally have done a very good job in controlling COVID and putting protocols and screening and all of those types of requirements in place. I know in Antigua, there is a requirement for every hotel room to be left empty for 48 hours after it was last used, so that any COVID infection risk is minimized. But it's, you know, it's not a market that is going to keep an airline flying and profitable on its own. And it, by its very nature, these are not actually very large markets, with probably the exception of Barbados, Cancun and the Dominican Republic. They are still relatively small markets for many airlines.
And for a long haul flight, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So we were going to look next at, we've got a slide that looks at the capacity on the transatlantic for, again, July 2019 and July this coming year, bearing in mind that we expect some of the July capacity to come out by carrier. And what we were trying to do here was to see, you know, just how concentrated the market is or not, and what's been happening. And then we're going to move on and look at how dependent some of the carriers are on transatlantic revenue. So what we're seeing here is that the number of airlines that we're seeing in the schedule now for July is a quarter less than it was 2 years ago. So in the last webinar in March, we talked about why we've seen so few airline failures, and I've been quite surprised. So there haven't been many airline failures, but actually we're seeing airlines retreating from markets like the transatlantic. I guess not surprisingly, it's hard to fly, there's lots of restrictions and so on, but I was quite surprised by the number being down by a quarter. That seems a lot fewer airlines. So those who are flying, they're flying less capacity, but the market is a bit more concentrated. Are we going to see more of that going forward, do you think? Are we going to see more consolidated market?
Well, we have the launch of Norse Air, of course, Norwegian Mark II with the previous management team that lost a fortune, hoping to lose another fortune probably. But I think the most interesting point here, Becca, is that ultimately, you know, for all of the excitement of new airlines, I think this is a portent of what we could see in the future, with actually fewer airlines operating and a degree of consolidation and increase in market share amongst the major carriers. Because it is so tough to survive, you know, and there are many airlines that just will not operate the same level of frequency or the same level of service that they've previously operated. To lose or to move from 49 to 38, so losing 11 airlines, 20% of the carriers who were operating transatlantic services in the space of 2 years. You know, and for the major carriers to now have a 76% capacity share is the sort of thing that would make a regulator feel nervous about any application for antitrust immunity or anything that was put in front of them in today's world.
Probably one of the most dense and heavily competitive markets though before that, wasn't it, John? So it's would be one of the first to fall.
Yeah, and you know, we've seen that with Norwegian and, you know, the demise there. But but it also does show the concentration. And Becca, you know, as you remark on some of your comments, a lot more use of next gen long haul aircraft. 747's gone, 380s no longer flying, 350s, 78s being used. It's a changing world and a changing market.
So a slightly more fuel efficient set of services than perhaps there were before.
Good for the environment.
Good for the environment. So we've looked at 4 different airlines here who operate on the transatlantic to see where their revenues used to come from. So this is looking at the whole year 2019 and using OAG traffic data to look at the revenue by sort of world region that they're flying. So North America being, you know, it's domestic and international traffic revenues from within North America. Just, you know, what struck me when we did this was just how varied they were. And actually, this is only a selection, but it shows BA to be more exposed really than the other airlines we're showing here. That, you know, I know you said that a lot of airlines get a lot of their revenue from the transatlantic, but actually looking at this, BA is just more exposed, isn't it, than the other carriers?
Yeah, they are. And 2 years ago, we'd have all looked at this and said, well, it's a bit of a risk, but, you know, the market's very stable. They've got a very strong position in it, et cetera, et cetera. And it's now essentially been closed to them for the last, 16 months. And what you're showing there is Europe, North America revenues, Becca. So, you know, if it does come back in the context of a bubble, it's only going to be UK, North America, and BA do carry a lot, or did carry a lot of connecting traffic. But to me, it also shows how strong and how important that domestic market has been for carriers like Delta and United. And if we compare those two carriers against, their two European counterparts below, you can see that in the case of Delta, nearly 3/4 of their revenues are coming in that North American market, nearly 60% in the case of United. They, even allowing for the collapse in US domestic traffic, they've been in a much stronger position. And of course, the challenge for them now is to rebuild their international revenues as we come into a recovery phase.
Interesting time. So let's move on. We've got 20 minutes left. I wanted to look at what I spoke about at the beginning, some of the network experimentation that we're seeing take place. So when we went and had a look at the routes that are being operated, we found that in the schedule this year, we're seeing 1,400 new routes launched, which is the highest number we've seen for a number of years. I guess that's because airlines maybe before didn't have spare capacity to operate new routes. They were quite tentative about putting an aircraft on a new route unless they had a new aircraft coming into the fleet. Airlines were reluctant to stop routes operating that they've had for some time. But now the risks are everywhere, so they're being much more experimental, aren't they?
Oh, great time to be an airline network planner. I mean, you can
a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. You can start with a clean piece of paper, go out and look at things that you probably looked at 5-6 years ago and rejected for whatever reason, and say, let's have a go, see if it works. It's a really, really good time. Of course, many of these new routes are not daily frequencies. They're perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. And some of them will be on smaller aircraft, and some of those are written down and have relatively low operating costs. So it's a great time, and you can see how it's played out in each region. So North America, obviously a lot of domestics. No surprise up there. We've seen that the hub bypass strategies, and we've got some slides on that a bit later. But even in Asia Pacific, more domestic routes. Peter, it's a great time to be a consultant advising airports, I would think.
Yeah, and certainly there's when you look at the share of domestic in Asia Pacific as well, China and Australia, and how China has quickly recovered its China domestic network is accounting for a lot of that. But I think from a European perspective, it's very impressive to see what Wizz has been doing. They made a choice early last year that they were going to go out and grab a very wide range of opportunities and try completely new things, and they were very public with it. And no other European airline has been so aggressive in trying new things. And they seem to have stuck with it for quite a long time so far.
Yeah, Becca, another interesting element to this is that, as you know, half of these new routes in Europe are being operated by LCCs, and it astounds me at how quickly LCCs have moved into new spaces and been flexible and added capacity, adjusted their working practices, and they've caught the legacy airlines off guard, who are in many cases so far behind in terms of loading their schedules. And I know they have real complexity around their international networks and connecting traffic, but the low-cost carriers are in a really, really good space at the moment.
Yeah,
yes,
infrastructure to be. Sorry, Becca.
No, go. You go, Peter.
They've got the infrastructure within their organisation to be nimble, and that's what it's all about for them. And from an airport's perspective, they need to be clear-eyed about these new experimental routes, and in a lot of cases they're going to work. But they also know that the airlines, be it low cost or legacy, will just as easily drop a route as starting. And so it's great opportunities. It's really an opportunity for the airports to be working with their local communities to make these routes as successful as they can while they've got this opportunity. And if you're a secondary airport in just outside the catchment area, I think of the major airports, particularly strong opportunities. Very smaller airports, quite away from principal cities, going to be pretty tough for them, and has been very tough over the last 12 months. But the nimbleness of the LCCs is very impressive. Interestingly, we can see that with Aeroflot and Turkish. They're actually also quite risk averse at the moment in what they want to do with their network compared to the Lufthansas and the British and Iberias, which are a lot more traditional the way they've been handling their network, I think. As you said earlier, John, a great time to be a network planner. Yeah,
and there's an interesting question that has been asked by Milan, who sort of is asking, is this high risk for airlines regarding the high uncertainty? And ultimately, no, it's not, because, you know, trust me, every one of these new routes will be cash generative. Every one of them will have significant funding and supporting funding from marketing, from the airports and other stakeholder communities. And yes, some of them will not stick, as we've said. But in the short term, for the airlines, if this is a way of increasing utilization, it's a way of operating with marginal profitability, and it's low risk because it's being underwritten by someone else, this is the best time ever to be trying this.
Yeah, and that was a direct, effectively exactly what the CEO of JetBlue was saying a few months ago. What a great time to experiment. Everything is risky now. In the past, they would be not wanting to rock the boat as such. Now they'll give everything a go.
Even transatlantic to Heathrow.
Let's see. That product that they put on their A321s is very impressive. It'll be an interesting observation if they go ahead.
Yeah.
So we've got a few examples of some of this experimentation now. So we've got two on this slide here. On the left, we've got Air New Zealand's Auckland to Hobart, which apparently has not been operated before. So not a huge market, but that's an example of an airline seeing an opportunity at this particular point in time. And then on the right, we've got some of the new routes United have started operating, the red ones being what they put in place for the winter, so a lot of new Florida routes. And then in the schedule for this year, we're seeing a lot more new sort of Midwest routes, but a lot of them are there's quite relatively small aircraft, aren't they, John? They're sort of 50-seater regional jets.
Yeah, they are not obviously all the way out to the Hawaiian island.
Not to Hawaii, no.
Bit of a trek, that one, but absolutely. And we were discussing this morning, that part of the opportunity and the exciting part of what we're seeing is that you have some aircraft such as the A220,
which I'm a big fan of.
Big fan, and lots of seat pitch, which you obviously need every inch of, Becca.
For 5 foot of me, yes.
Yeah, that's fine.
The big windows.
So but it is fascinating, the ability to experiment at the moment with flexible aircraft that are capable of doing 5.5-hour sectors or even a 2-hour sector with the same degree of efficiency. It really is the best ever time to be a network planner.
We had a question earlier which related to Europe, will it be some destinations that see growth and recovery? And the US's domestic market is further ahead in many ways in recovery, and this is about some destinations and about leisure travel, and particularly it's outdoors, isn't it? It's people going somewhere where they can fly non-stop. There is obviously some hub traffic here, but it's about going to outdoor destinations, isn't it? We think so. We're seeing Orlando grow and not Las Vegas. We're seeing, I think you were commenting earlier about Montana and seeing growth. And the pattern here is definitely looking at sort of coastal beach holiday type things, which I guess is what we'd expect elsewhere in Europe.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, I was looking at some US data yesterday, and the states with the largest year-on-year percentage growth in capacity are places like Montana and Wyoming and South Carolina. And as much as that is, you know, people leaving those states to go down to Florida and other sun points, a lot of it is about these wide open spaces, and those hotels that are in the wilderness are apparently having very good forward bookings, because that's where people want to go, away from others and avoid the crowds.
And I guess
We've got
fueled
another.
by the fact that each state in the US sets its own rules and there's very little coordination between them. So as opportunities come up, I imagine the airlines do everything they can to try and grab them.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned Wizz earlier, Peter. We've got a slide here on Wizz. On the right, you can see these are all the routes that are new in Wizz's schedule this year. Lots and lots of them. So taking advantage of what they expect to be some UK travel down to the Spanish islands, new base in Oslo in Norway, and quite a bit in Eastern Europe. And somebody's commented about how many routes, when we were talking about the new routes earlier, have been dropped versus started. So this shows you, this chart on the left shows you in each year how many have been dropped and how many added, how many new, you know, dropped and then new routes added. So we can see a very large amount of churn here. You know, 269 new routes is a large proportion added, but also a lot dropped in the, you know, that were operated last year.
Yeah, and the important thing, Becca, for the airports is, you know, network churn is absolutely fine, but the important thing is to keep the base aircraft. You know, if you've suddenly got one or two base aircraft from Wizz or someone else, then you want to keep them. And if that means a destination is dropped for another one being added, or something is, you know, sees reduced frequency, then that's just a fact of life. I mean, if you look at Wizz's network map on the right hand side, and what they're planning to do, then clearly with their base in Abu Dhabi, they're very well placed there, not just to go back up into Europe, but also into Central Asia and ultimately even perhaps the Indian subcontinent. But I think it won't be long before some of those Central Asian destinations are being joined back to other destinations in Europe as part of this constant growth of the Wizz Air network and their expansionary model. You know, driving productivity, taking advantage of the time zones throughout Europe, maximizing the hours every day on an aircraft. It's a model that can be very, very successful in the next couple of years.
And Wizz have been very consistent in the past with their focus on Central and Eastern Europe as being the basis for their network. And it's only in the last couple of years that they started to look at doing, if you like, west to west type networks. And they've made it work. And that's given them, I think, the capability and the determination to try things like Abu Dhabi, completely different, complete departure for them in their business plan, but an opportunity that they saw. And similarly going into Norway, quite an extraordinary change for them to be operating domestic services in a country that doesn't have their traditional Central European core to it. So an innovative carrier that's trying some very different things right in the middle of all of this uncertainty.
Yeah, good. Thanks very much, Peter. We've just got couple of slides left. We often in this afternoon webinar look at the US TSA data, so we've just got a little update here. This is the data of people being screened at US airports. So in the absence of really current traffic data, this data is available just a day or two after the passengers have been screened. And so it gives quite a current snapshot of where traffic is. We're showing it actually to March here because we're doing months rather than days now, but it's looking quite healthy, isn't it? Certainly March saw a nice boost to the traffic numbers through the US airports.
Yeah, there was a spring in the numbers in March. Maybe it was because of the spring break season in the US. I think it will be very good to see what April looks like and whether this is, an upward trend, or was it literally the spring break impact. Seasonality of Easter can also, or the calendarization of Easter can also have an impact as well, Becca. But as I say, the US domestic market has been going gangbusters in the last couple of months, and long may it continue.
Pardon me. And our final slide, we just wanted to say something about the Tasman bubble. So last year we had a lot of discussion about bubbles, green corridors, all sorts of names for different ways to try and open up selected markets. Next week, we see the start of the Tasman bubble, so between Australia and New Zealand, which this is a good sign, isn't it? I mean, it's obviously for New Zealand, Australia is a really big market and vice versa. So this is really important for both of these countries. But are there lessons here for elsewhere? Is this the start of seeing new bubbles opening up, or is this more of an isolated example?
I think it's a really interesting development, but I think it's also highlights a massive problem for both Australia and New Zealand in that they are locked down, and it's going to be really difficult for them to really grow international connectivity, given the hesitancy that they are both showing about COVID rates. And some of the slides we had this morning, Becca, where we were showing how much Chinese capacity there is to Australia, and also how many Australians normally head to Bali and Indonesia. They've got to find a way to start international services beyond just this bilateral bubble.
Yeah, okay. Well, we've got a few minutes. Let's take a few of the questions that have been coming in that we haven't been able to answer so far. John, a techie question here on OAG data. How reliable are the forward schedules in predicting actual flights? And have we observed carriers changing their approach to timing and revising schedules? I think some of the analysis we did recently is showing that we're seeing much less variation in the schedules than we were. It's getting better each month, but we're still seeing quite a lot of, early on, lots of capacity coming out.
Yeah, I looked at a snapshot on Monday comparing this week's data against what was loaded in the schedules last week to operate this week. And some airlines are making up to 20% capacity changes 7 days before travel. And one airline, looking the other way, is currently still showing the schedule it operated in 2019 for operation in 2 weeks' time. And that is about, it's about 400% more than what they're currently operating. So airlines are working at different paces and have different strategies. The US carriers are cancelling their flights, international flights that they know are not going to operate between 8 and 6 weeks before departure, and their domestic ones around 4 weeks. But as I say, in Europe, some carriers are doing it at 7 days or less notice. So it's a very fluid situation, and so frustrating for travellers. And the airlines will tell you that they're doing this because they want to be able to operate, and they're just waiting for government guidance and clarity as to what they can and cannot do.
Okay, we've got another question about, I guess, economic recession. I don't know at the moment whether we're heading for a recession. I think most economies are picking up a bit, aren't they? But where do we see the sort of economic, what's happening in the economy as being a factor with demand for air travel as we move forward?
Good question. Don't know in any great detail what the impact will be. Only time will tell. I think one of the things I always look at is the price of fuel, because it always tends to increase when economic activity is strengthening. That price has, for aviation fuel, has increased quite significantly in the last 12 months. I don't think that many parts of the world are looking at a recession in the next 15, 16 months, and we're just, you know, looking for pure demand recovery in the aviation sector.
Great, thanks. And one more question. I don't know, Peter, if maybe you want to have a go at this one. Do we expect a sort of structural change in the average age of travellers? Are we seeing a different pattern of travel? Are older travellers more reluctant to travel, and younger ones more, you know, prepared to take risks as they see it, or is it the other way around? Is it the vaccinated older people who are happy to book travel at the moment?
I see it as being sort of more short-term impacts where, yes, at the moment there's the risk-averse younger people prepared to jump onto very short notice, particularly low-cost carrier type capacity opportunities and grabbing them. But at the same time, I don't think that that's necessarily going to be a structural change at all. I think that very quickly, as vaccinations increase and as people become more attuned to how to manage traveling in a pandemic environment, that everyone will be grabbing that opportunity again. And being able to do frequent short trips in Asia or in Europe, domestically, people are prepared to do it. So I think there's short-term changes. Both of those points about young and old that you make are valid, but I don't think they're structural or long-term. I think we're likely to still see innovation and short-term good opportunities from younger travellers, higher yielding, longer trips, more expensive, more luxury travel from the older, and business will come back into the market as well, but a significant delay beyond leisure and VFR.
Okay, that's interesting. So that sounds quite positive in the long term. We don't have those structural changes. We've come around to 4 o'clock now, so we'll finish there. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you, John and Peter, for your contributions. I really enjoyed all your answers and your insights today. It's been great. We'll be back with the next webinar on Wednesday, the 19th of May, so do sign up for that then. And as I say, thank you for joining us, and thank you to my guests today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.